So this is the Tyburn Jig. Saint Monday, April 1774, Newgate. She promised herself two things today: that she'd not lose sight of him, and she'd not cry. The first should have been easier by far, but now, pushing through the raucous execution day crowd full of people seeming to possess considerably more elbows and knees than they had any right to, she wasn't so sure. Sarah Middleton was a small woman, not above 5 feet 3 inches high, even in her heeled and buckled shoes. A big man like Fred might span her tiny waist with 2 hands, and a few had tried before Fred saw them off. She was dressed entirely in black today, not in anticipation of her imminent widowhood, but because that's what Mrs. Grange insisted her employees at the milliner's wore, even those stuck in the workroom behind the shop who never saw the customers. Sarah would have to work late tonight. She only had a half day off, and that given grudgingly, for she told nobody that her husband was to hang today. Sarah had invented an ailing relative, but in the noonday heat and crush, she couldn't now recall whether it was a great aunt or a second cousin. What tangled webs we weave, she thought, trying to shake the ache from her head. Mrs. Grange was sure to remember, and sure to ask, in that casually polite way that meant she suspected you in a lie. Sarah wished she'd made a note somewhere, wished she carried a pocketbook like Fred always did, though it was that put the noose about his neck in the end. It was good weather for a hanging, though not for Sarah. The road would stay dry and dusty all the way to the Triple Tree, and the hawkers would rake in the pennies from ballad sheets and pies. Fred wasn't the only condemned man being dispatched today. Of course, sharing the cart were a horse stealer, a highwayman, and 2 prolific pickpockets, whose pals would probably be working the crowd, even as a brace of their own danced the Tyburn Jig. The morning bells of St. Sepulchre tolled slow and sonorous, and those nearest the jail's black gate muttered in anticipation. A creak, a squeak, a neigh. The crowd belly-roared, and they came out, and not before time. The noon bell's last echo was already dying away. 3 of the fellows were badly dressed, shabby as London sparrows, but there was one who was almost a macaroni, with a tall white wig and a pea green coat, and another who donned his wedding suit to kiss the hangman's daughter. Sarah had heard a few of the condemned did that. She supposed it was a joke. She thought it an awful poor taste. She willed the fellow in green to turn round. It must be Fred. He always was a dandy, and he loved his coloured silks. His hands were bound behind him, already bloodless and white. Her heart throbbed for him stupidly, and she scolded it. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Stand and deliver!" There was a burst of laughter, and the green-jacketed man turned around, revealing a pocked complexion and a hooked nose. Robert Dale, the highwayman then, not Fred. Not Fred at all. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. She should not care. She would not cry. Not even though Fred was wearing the suit she'd last seen on their marriage day for a second hempen wedding. He'd been so handsome that day. She should never have wed him. Even then, she'd known. The city marshal and his men rode out, surrounding the execution cart. Some of the mob turned from pelting the pickpockets with corn husks and rotten potatoes to try their aim at the uniformed guards, bright and upright in the glaring sun. One guard fired his rifle in the air and yelled. Cowed, the rabble fell back, and the slow procession began. The 2 miles to Tyburn would take as many hours with such a press of people on the streets. 2 hours to live, maybe 3. She hoped Fred would make use of them. She hoped he was prey. The Bowl Inn, St. Giles. Onlookers were crushed at the windows and doors of this tumble-down little tavern, which would do more business in an hour today than in the whole rest of the week. Inside, the prisoners were supping their penultimate drinks, and some of the riflemen had joined them, more to slake their own thirst than keep the crowd at bay. Fred'll have hot rum, thought Sarah, remembering how he liked it, spiced with pepper and horseradish as well as cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves. Hot as the devil's blood, he'd always say when she made it for him, and pull her down into his lap and laugh. He'd met her in a pub. The other woman. The one whose name Sarah declined to speak and prayed to forget. The one he was on his way to swing for. He'd not met her at the bowl, but the Exmouth Arms, 2 streets away from their little house in Clerkenwell. What she'd been doing in there, who could say? Nothing she'd owned to in church, Sarah guessed. Georgiana. A high-sounding name for a low sort of woman, all bouncing bubbies in yellow ringlets, brazen little bitch. He'd had women before. She wouldn't have minded, but this one was different. Expensive taste. Fred couldn't keep up both the household's wife and mistress too, not on a groom's wage, and he chose Georgiana. Sarah would never forgive him that, not if he beseeched her on the scaffold. She found a haberdasher's bill in his waistcoat pocket, a list of extraordinary, extravagant things, dyed ostrich feathers, yards of silk ribbon, trimmings and beadings and lace. Always leaving things in his pockets was Fred, careless, like so many criminals, so many who were caught and hanged anyhow. She'd said nothing, just left the bill folded neatly under his plate at dinner, so when he'd finished his chop and pushed the plate away, he'd seen it. And the look on his face was enough. He left that same night, knowing when the gig was up, having chosen already anyway. A week went by, a fortnight, a month. Still, Sarah told nobody he'd left. Away on business was all the neighbours knew. One time he came round. 2 in the morning it must have been, nearly beat the door down, begging to be taken back. Finally, she let him in just to shut him up. Georgiana was a devil, a treacherous siren, a villainess, he'd said. Couldn't live with the woman anymore. Sarah had folded her arms and said nothing. There he sat, weeping into his hot rum, his new blue coat ruined with mud, one pocket flapping loose. Once she'd have mended that. Now she gave him a drink and sent him back to his hall. A week later, Georgiana's pretty head was found tumbling in the Fleet, the rest of her to follow. She'd let Fred keep her and clothe her, it seemed, but wouldn't leave off her other gentleman. They found letters from her in his coat, blood-stained, as was his pocketbook. He said they'd had a fight and she'd gone off. He hadn't seen her for 5 days before she turned up again, bobbing down the river in bits. Nobody believed him. Standing in the dock, he hardly looked as if he believed it himself. Dazed. That was the word. Like his old life was a dream he was trying to remember, slipping away. Sarah, veiled, had sat at the back of the public gallery, imagining he was watching her every time he looked up. The jury took 5 minutes to find him guilty. The judge only 1 to settle the black cap on his grey wig and sentence Fred to hang. A bumptious cheer as the door of the inn opened. 2 guardsmen stepped out, followed by the prisoners looking a lot less glum, especially the pea-green silken highwayman, whose powder had sweated off, his face now a shiny strawberry against his suit. Fred came out waving like he was the Prince Bloody Regent at a public promenade. In his hand was a pewter tankard of ale. He showed it to the crowd, drained it off and tossed it up, flashing in the sun, to be caught by a kiss-blowing doxy or an idle apprentice. The guards pushed him roughly against the cart, tied his hands back off, tossed him into the straw like a sap. He sat up, smiling, his dark wedding coat dusted with hay, and executed a clumsy bow. "I'll buy you all a pint on the way back," he yelled, and a gust of laughter spread through the appreciative audience. Always liked to be liked, did Fred. Always the soul of the party. Quick to laugh, eager to please. She would not cry. The Mason's Arms, Seymour Place. The last stop, and the prisoner's last drink. Food, too, if they could stomach it, though it was hard to eat with one hand manacled to the wall. Sarah felt weak and hungry in the heat herself. She bought 2 oranges from a street seller and opened the flesh of one with her pocket knife, sucking its juice greedily. Another hot rum for Fred's final drink on earth. Fresh orange squeezed into the smoking glass gave it a citrusy zing. Georgiana's last drink had been hot rum too, made just the way Fred liked it because Sarah didn't know any other way. She'd turned up the night after he had, in a rain-spattered dress, her fine hat awry, ostrich feathers bent and drooping, the yards of expensive silk ribbon half torn off her skirts and sleeves. Sarah had seen what he saw in her then. Even so dishevelled, she was a rosy, buxom, winsome thing, bursting with youth. She listened quietly, sipping ale, waiting for the powder in Georgiana's rum to take effect as the girl babbled about how Sarah had to take Fred back, that she was afraid for her life. She'd done wrong to steal him away. Eventually, she stopped talking, and Sarah went to work. She knew a slaughterman at Smithfield. Fred wasn't the only one with secrets. He got a guinea for his work and his silence, and she promised more besides, when he cared to stop the night. They couldn't be seen together for a while, not till after Fred's trial anyway. Sarah knew there'd be a trial because Fred had left his blue coat at hers, and Georgiana had had a letter in her gown telling him she was leaving, which she hadn't dared to send. A finger prick for Sarah's blood over that and the pocketbook, and the coat pushed through an open window for the law to find when she passed Fred's house next day. And it was done. Tyburn tree. The gallery was heaving. Sarah strained on tiptoes to watch as the hawkers branded copies of the last dying speeches. Daring Rob, the highwayman's ballad, was outselling the Clerkenwell butchers, she noticed. And he hadn't even killed anyone. Fame. Fickle fame. Fred stepped up, wearing that same uncertain expression she recalled from their wedding day. The hangman, a hulking fellow, all bald head and huge hands, blindfolded and hooded him. His arms were already tied. The pickpockets and horse stealer had stopped dancing 5 minutes back, and it was time for the main event. Poor Rob Dare was green as his suit now, and Fred looked about him anxiously, even with the hood on, as though he'd lost something. For the briefest of instants, Sarah wondered if it was her he was looking for, then scoffed at her own foolishness. She stared a second longer, then, as the hangman reached for the lever, averted her eyes. She heard the slam of the trapdoor, the creak of the stretched ropes, and the crowd's gasping groan. But all she saw was the heartless blue of the April sky as she turned her face up towards the sun and smiled.